What if a single pitch, one call in the second inning brought down an umpire, exposed two players, and forced MLB to make a decision it has never made before in the modern era of the sport? That is exactly what happened. And at the center of it all stood Shohei Ohtani, a man who in years of playing at the highest level of professional baseball had never once publicly lost his composure on a field. Until now. This is not a routine officiating controversy. This is not a story about a borderline call that reasonable people can debate. This is a story about a catastrophic breakdown of integrity, an emergency institutional response, a rare public confession, and a face-to-face reckoning that took place inside a room most people will never see. Every layer of the story will be covered, from the second inning pitch to the moment Ohtani spoke words that spread to tens of millions of people before the inning had even ended. To understand why this moment hit the baseball world with the force that it did, you have to understand who Shohei Ohtani is, not just as a player but as a professional. Ohtani is widely regarded as the greatest player in baseball today. He pitches at an elite level. He hits at an elite level. He does both simultaneously, which no player at his caliber has done since Babe Ruth. His 2023 season with the Los Angeles produced 44 home runs and a 3.14 ERA as a pitcher, numbers that individually would make a player an all-star. Together, they made him something that the sport had not seen in generations. But his statistical dominance is only part of the story. What defines Ohtani as much as his talent is his composure. He does not argue with umpires. He does not play to the crowd. He does not allow the emotional turbulence of a long baseball season, the bad calls, the slumps, the media pressure to surface in his conduct on the field. He absorbs pressure quietly, performs at an extraordinary level, and moves on. That is who he is. That has always been who he is. That is precisely why, when a man who never loses composure loses it, the whole world pays attention. When the most composed player in the sport stops, stiffens, and speaks, it does not mean he had a bad day. It means something was seriously wrong. The stadium was loud. The energy inside was the kind that builds when two elite competitors are locked in a genuine battle, when every pitch matters and every count carries weight. Ohtani came to the plate in the second inning with the at-bat building exactly as you would expect when an elite hitter faces an elite pitcher. He was patient. He was intelligent. He worked the count with precision, reading each pitch with the kind of focus that separates generational players from merely great ones. The tension in the stadium escalated with each delivery. Fans leaned forward, dugouts were alert, then came the pitch. It was outside, not borderline outside, not the kind of location that umpires can reasonably disagree on, but clearly, visibly, measurably outside the strike zone. Anyone watching in the stadium could see it. Anyone watching on television could see it. The broadcast data confirmed it in real time. The umpire raised his hand, strike. The stadium reacted before the dust had settled, and Ohtani, for the first time in memory, did not simply reset and prepare for the next pitch. The reaction was immediate and it was unified. Both dugouts responded. Every fan in the stadium responded. TV analysts watching in real time responded, not with the measured hedging that broadcasters typically use when discussing umpire calls, but with unambiguous clarity. The call was wrong. This was not a judgment call. It was not a situation where the umpire saw something that could be interpreted differently from a different angle. The technology that MLB has invested in to track pitch location, technology used in every broadcast, confirmed what everyone already knew. The pitch was not a strike. The umpire behind the plate had a history. Previous controversies had been attached to his record before, not fabricated grievances, but documented instances where his calls had drawn scrutiny. Questions had been raised before this night, but nothing had ever reached this level. Nothing had ever produced this kind of unified, cross-sport, cross-platform condemnation. What made this particular call so consequential, beyond the technology, beyond the stadium reaction, was what it changed. It shifted the complexion of the entire at-bat. In a game where every pitch matters, a wrong call at that moment was not a minor inconvenience. It was a material alteration of the competition itself. Before Ohtani said a single word, his body said everything. His posture stiffened. There was a pause, not the routine pause of a hitter resetting between pitches, but a deliberate, weighted pause. He stepped back slightly, and the look in his eyes, visible to cameras, visible to players on both benches, visible to the umpire himself, carried something beyond frustration. It was disbelief combined with something harder, something that had clearly reached a threshold. Then he spoke. "This is the biggest disgrace of the year." The impact in the stadium was immediate. Players on both benches looked up. Coaches moved to the edges of their dugouts. Fans who had been loud fell into a brief, stunned silence, the kind of silence that only happens when something genuinely unprecedented occurs. The video spread across social media before the inning had even ended. Within hours, it had reached tens of millions of views. By the following morning, it was not simply a baseball story. It was a sports story, a cultural story, a story being discussed on platforms and in conversations that had nothing to do with the sport itself. Biggest disgrace of the year was not just a quote, it became a headline that dominated overnight. The response from the baseball world was as unified as the stadium reaction had been, and it came from every direction simultaneously. Former players spoke publicly. Current players spoke publicly. Managers, analysts, journalists, and broadcasters across every major outlet reached the same three-part verdict. The call was wrong, Ohtani's reaction was justified, and the fact that he, of all people, reacted in that way made it more damning than any reaction from any other player could have been. Because when a player known for arguing reacts to a bad call, it is expected. When Shohei Ohtani reacts to a bad call, a man with no history of umpire confrontations, no history of public outbursts, no history of anything but composed professionalism, it functions as evidence. His reaction was not emotional noise. It was a signal. Every major sports publication covered it. Every major broadcast and radio program covered it. The phrase "biggest disgrace of the year" was repeated in dozens of languages across international sports media. The pressure on MLB's officiating department did not build slowly. It became impossible to ignore overnight. MLB does not move fast on officiating matters. That is not a criticism. It is a structural reality of a sport that has historically protected umpire authority and independence as foundational to the game's function. Umpires carry significant institutional standing in professional baseball. Their decisions are rarely overturned. Their employment is rarely threatened by a single game, which is exactly why what MLB did next was historically extraordinary. There was no quiet internal memo. There was no slow review process that would conclude weeks later with a carefully worded non-statement. There was no diplomatic language designed to protect the institution while appearing to address the concern. The umpire was fired immediately. MLB's official statement confirmed that the call was incorrect beyond reasonable doubt, that the decision had been made at the highest levels of the organization, and that it reflected the league's non-negotiable commitment to the integrity of the game. The statement was clear. It was direct. It left no room for ambiguity. The message sent to every umpire and official in the sport was not subtle. The standards of this game are not flexible, and the consequences for failing to meet them, particularly in a moment of this magnitude, are real and immediate. Everyone expected a defense. When public figures face this level of scrutiny, when their professional conduct becomes the subject of international attention and institutional action, the standard response is to deflect, to qualify, to issue a statement crafted by a legal team designed to admit as little as possible. That is not what happened. The umpire issued a full, honest, unqualified admission. "I made a judgment I now understand was incorrect." He accepted that the reaction to his call was justified. He accepted responsibility for the consequences that followed: the filing, the investigation, the confrontation that the league facilitated. He did not attempt to contextualize the call in a way that softened his responsibility. He did not claim that the technology was wrong, or that his angle was different, or that reasonable people could disagree. What this admission did was significant on multiple levels. It closed the factual debate entirely. There was no longer a question of whether the call was wrong, because the man who made it confirmed that it was. It allowed the conversation to move beyond that specific moment and toward the larger institutional questions that the incident had raised. And it was remarkable, genuinely remarkable, for its honesty and its completeness, in a professional environment where that level of direct accountability is almost never seen. What it could not do was restore his career, and what it could not do was undo the damage that had already been set in motion, because the investigation had already uncovered something more. The firing of the umpire was not the end of the story. MLB's investigation, which had been triggered by the events of that second inning, uncovered something additional, something that extended well beyond the umpire's call and into the conduct of players on the field. Two opposing players were found to be connected to circumstances surrounding the call. The details of their involvement raised serious questions about the integrity of what had happened that night. Questions about whether the events of that inning were entirely coincidental, or whether something more deliberately troubling had taken place. The league's response was not to process this through a lengthy formal hearing, or to allow it to be resolved through statements and representatives. Instead, MLB facilitated something that has almost no precedent in professional sports at this level: a direct confrontation. A face-to-face personal reckoning, not before a panel, not before lawyers, not in front of cameras, before Shohei Ohtani himself. The atmosphere inside that room was described by those with knowledge of it as extraordinarily tense and deeply emotional, two conditions that rarely coexist in professional settings, where people are trained to manage their presentation. Two professional players stood before the man they had wronged. There was no process to hide behind. There were no statements to read. There was no distance that could be maintained between what they had done and the person who had been directly affected by it. Ohtani's conduct in that room was consistent with everything that defines him publicly. He listened without interrupting. He did not perform anger. He did not use the occasion to humiliate. He was focused, measured, and fully present, which in that context may have been more difficult for the two players to face than any display of anger would have been. When Ohtani spoke, it was not about the call. It was not about the at-bat. It was not even specifically about what the two players had done. It was about the principle. Every player at every level of this sport, in every stadium, in every country, deserves fairness and respect regardless of their origin, their language, or their level of fame. That principle is not a courtesy. It is not optional. It is the foundation on which competition has any meaning at all. In his hope expressed directly to the two players standing before him, was that this entire episode, the call, the reaction, the investigation, the firing, the confession in this room, would serve as a permanent reminder that those principles are non-negotiable. The two players left silently. Their expressions, by all accounts, said everything that no statement could have conveyed. What happened in that second inning and everything that followed is more than a story about one bad call. It is a genuine reckoning with officiating standards, with accountability structures, and with what fairness and integrity are supposed to mean at the highest level of professional sport. MLB has long prided itself on the authority and independence of its umpires. That authority has value, but authority without accountability is not integrity, it is simply power. And what this episode demonstrated in the most public and consequential way possible is that the gap between those two things had become impossible to ignore. The historical significance of each individual element is real. An emergency firing of an umpire based on a single call, a public confession from that umpire, direct and unqualified, a league-facilitated confrontation between players and the man they wronged. A statement from the most composed player in the sport that traveled to tens of millions of people in hours. Each of those things individually would represent a significant moment in the sport's history. Together, they represent something larger, a turning point for how baseball handles integrity, not as a concept to be referenced in press releases, but as a standard to be enforced with real consequences when it is violated. Shohei Ohtani will return to the field. That is not a statement about resilience or recovery, it is simply a description of who he is and what he does. He will step into the batter's box again. He will prepare for the next pitch. He will continue performing at a level that has no real parallel in the current era of the sport. But this moment will not be forgotten, not by the league, not by the players who were in that room, not by the umpires who are now operating under a standard that has been enforced in the most visible way possible, and not by the fans who watched it unfold in real time. The integrity of the game is not just a principle worth defending. It is the only thing that makes any of this matter at all. The competition, the records, the contracts, the broadcasts, the history, none of it holds meaning if the foundation beneath it is not sound. What Ohtani said on that field, what MLB did in the hours that followed, and what happened inside that room are now part of the record, and the record is clear.